Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this week's podcast by the Education Showroom. And I'm delighted to welcome Tom Reynolds, CEO and founder of EdenFiftyOne. But Tom's got a really interesting story to share with you today. Not only is Tom the CEO of EdenFiftyOne, but he's also an educator and he's also dyslexic. And we're going to blend these areas, these features, these points of real interest into today's podcast. Before we go any further, ladies and gentlemen, you've chosen to listen to this podcast because clearly the title has piqued your interest. That title is the literacy gap getting bigger? What is being done? And we explore new strategies and approaches that can be considered by your school or multi-academy. So it's a really interesting theme today. Tom, good afternoon. Great to see you. And we'd love to hear a little bit about yourself, so your background, your history, which I know is exciting. So yeah, we'd love to know about and learn about Tom Reynolds.
Okay, no problem. Thank you, Matt. I have spent over 20 years in UK state secondary education as a classroom teacher, as a 5 times head of English, and as an assistant head teacher. Over the last 5 or 6 years, I've also worked as an English advisor, supporting schools and MATs across the country with all things English, from classroom experience to examination outcomes. Throughout that time, my main focus has always been on clarity. Clarity for teachers, clarity for learners, and clarity for leaders as well at school and MAT level, because I believe that English education is often quite overwhelming and quite sort of maybe gaseous in its ability to be held and contained and worked with. And so since my very first months in English teaching, I went down this rabbit hole of trying to find a clarity of English education that could lead to better understanding, better ownership, better proficiency, and better outcomes. And I founded EdenFiftyOne because I wanted to improve the experience of English education for those on both sides of the desk. And I believe that I've always tried to do that by promoting clarity above everything else.
Yeah, that's a great intro, Tom, and a lovely story as well. And you are one of those unique individuals that has been in a classroom, been a senior leader, now is the founder of an EdTech solution and an approach and a methodology based around your areas of expertise, your passion, and it's great to hear the impact that EdenFiftyOne is having. What I would love to do is touch on your dyslexia, which I think is a really interesting point that we'd like to learn. And yeah, I'm sure the listeners today would love to learn about your story when it comes to dyslexia, Tom, please.
So about 3 or 4 days after finishing my English degree, I was diagnosed dyslexic by my university in Manchester, and probably more specific than general dyslexia, it was a dysgraphia, or fear of a blank page, as it's sometimes or colloquially referred to. The idea of producing something from nothing, so very much in an exam kind of situation, blank page that needs to be turned into 2 or 3 or 4 pages full of information, and your entire being is going to be rated on your ability to do that. So mine was more of a dysgraphia. For a number of years, I suppose, prior to that, I had struggled with the idea of getting my ideas out, struggled with the application, getting my ideas out onto paper, and especially during assessment or exam times. But I could sit in a library for hours, unable to bridge the gap between the ideas that I'd got in my head and the blank page in front of me. And that diagnosis was quite a relief, really, even though it came 3 or 4 days too late, you could argue.
Yeah.
But it did mean that it gave me a fantastic catalyst to receive that in the June And then in the September, I thought, right, I'm going to become an English teacher. I'm going to qualify as an English teacher, and I did the graduate teacher program and fast-tracked in 6 months. I started teaching straight away, and I knew that my role in that was, right, how do we improve the experience and the outcomes for other people? Now I'm sort of behind the desk with that real empathy of learner complexity that I realized that my peers generally wouldn't have that.
It's really interesting, isn't it? I'm
Yeah,
thinking about that timing, Tom. Goodness me, just literally a few days after your examinations. Oh, goodness me.
yeah, I I've been asked many times about that, and I have to be honest, there was just a relief. There was no anger, there was no frustration.
Mm.
You know, for a lot of people born in 80s, sort of educated through 80s, 90s, and prior to that, I wasn't dyslexic at school. I was lazy. I was distracted, and I was all of those things as well. So I didn't exactly do my best to make my uh, symptoms kind of pure and obvious to people. So there's no blame attributed at any stage here, but it meant that it gave me what I consider to be the best possible catalyst for going into English teaching, and that
Yeah.
wasn't because I had an out and out passion for it, which is maybe a strange thing for some people to hear. I had a passion for how do we make this clearer for people?
Mm.
How do we prioritize clarity at all costs? And I don't, for the education that I received, it was the consideration of the complexity from the learner's point of view on a class basis was just impossible.
Mm.
I really needed to focus on how do we make sure that everyone has clarity so that they can build understanding, ownership, and proficiency. Because if we expect them to build proficiency or love of a language without the fundamental building blocks of clarity, then not everybody in the class or the year group or the school is involved. And so I really had a learner focused empathy and mission
Yeah.
from the outset.
Love that. That's great, Tom. Thank you very much. And I think that dovetails perfectly into one of the next kind of angles I'd like to explore with you today, Tom, which I can't believe we're going back into into this period of time, but the lockdown slash COVID-19, let's call it window. We hear a lot at the Education Showroom about the literacy gap, not just now, but why is it in many people's minds and experience? Why is it so big? Why is it getting bigger? And why is it so hard to bridge that gap? And I want to just dial back, if I may, to, as I said, the lockdown slash COVID-19 period. I'd love for us to explore what that period potentially did in terms of a negative impact on literacy, in other words, making the gap bigger. And I'd love to kind of learn your views around social media. Does that have any impact on literacy or not? Online, gaming, phones, computers, laptops, things like this. So I'd love to just kind of explore and touch on those points, Tom, if I may.
Of course, and I think it goes without saying, whatever points I would mention on this as contributing towards it, I will miss out 10 or 20 because it is so multi-layered. I think we probably have to start with the general foundational debt that arrives at the school gates. So not even just the literacy gaps, but recent Ofsted reports and EEF Education Endowment Foundation research has confirmed that children are now entering school system with a significant regression in speech, language, in physical transcription ability. So by the time they're hitting year 7, they're further behind than ever. When students are hitting year 11, they're further behind than ever. This isn't just in literacy. I think any year 11 teacher would tell you that the level of year 11s that they're dealing with, that they were used to dealing with 5 or 10 years ago, has regressed. I think any year 6 teacher, year 7 teacher, I think they would all tell you the same, and that literacy is one of the areas that is in deficit. So I think that generally children are starting school and working their way through school in a lower position than they have been previously. The disadvantage gap is also becoming something that is more structurally entrenched, because socioeconomic background is a great predictor, a greater predictor now, maybe success, than it was 5 years ago. I think that as much as gaps can be seen across all students, and that the literacy gap can be seen to be as exacerbated from COVID up to now, the disadvantaged gap is also something that is growing significantly. Whilst there were great pains to reduce that in 2019, and I believe that from about 2019 it had actually gone backwards for about the very first time, that is now climbing. Getting into literacy then, if we were going to zoom in specifically for the literacy gaps, there is no doubt from the National Literacy Trust research, and again I think from the recent EAF Education Endowment Fund research, that fewer students enjoy reading for pleasure than they ever have done. The majority of students might be getting their enjoyment of story from computer games, but obviously there's no transcription to this. But again, I think to zoom back out, rather than pinning this just as the feet rather of young people and saying it's because young people aren't reading, young people are ingrained in social media, so are adults. I think trying to suggest that it's only young people's literacy standards that are regressing would be untrue. As a society, we cannot expect young people to pick up books when they get home and start reading if we're not.
Yeah.
You ask any adult, regardless of how academic they consider themselves to be or how academic their profession may be, compare their reading habits with their reading habits from 10 years ago. We cannot expect young people to lessen their diet of social media and improve their long text resilience and their longer form text resilience if we're not modeling that. And I think this is the challenge. Whilst we keep talking about it being a literacy gap for young people and the impact of social media and COVID, I think the gaps go much further than just in literacy. I think literacy is not perhaps a byproduct, but is simply one of the things that has regressed.
Yeah.
And I think to just suggest it's for young people would be, as a society, a misjudgment. I think this is a societal issue. I think this is potentially a global issue. And maybe this is something that Ofsted are attempting to get a handle of in the recent information that's come out about just trying to remove phones from school culture. Maybe.
Yeah, interesting. Tom, so much there that's incredibly interesting, and thank you for sharing. And I think it's perfectly tied into the next kind of phase of the question, which is working with schools and multi-academy trusts on a daily, weekly basis, living it, eating it, breathing it, and everything in between. What are you hearing, seeing that schools and MATs are trying to do themselves or have done themselves, initiatives, strategies, ideas to try and close this gap, try and improve the standards of literacy across their schools? So what are they trying to do themselves that you are seeing and experiencing?
So I've come up with 5 things here. These are 5 things that I have seen to one degree or another within different schools or academies across the country. But these are also 5 things that I would absolutely believe in as being part of a school or academy-wide policy.
Mm.
The first is the stamina for long-form text,
Mm.
so that young people and older people are attempting to retune those neural pathways for deep reading that quick skimming has eroded. Now, there is plenty of research and scientific literature out there to suggest that whilst one of these things is in focus, so the idea of scrolling through videos and quickly identifying different words or bits of information, and whilst in some ways it's great for like rapid fire, the ability to extract evidence from all over a page and just pick bits out that are important and valuable to us. In tuning that, we have detuned our stamina for long form text focus.
Mm. Mm.
It's important to say here that that doesn't mean that we have to have the same approach maybe to telling young people how to read in the same ways that maybe I was, or that you would have been, that you have to read 200 pages. It has to be Dickens. It has to be Shakespeare. It's frankly just not true. In a GCSE English language exam, a student is asked to grapple with approximately 500 words, which is about a page and a half of A4 with standard handwriting. That's how much they're asked to produce as a sort of benchmark if they're producing their own writing. And then that's how much they're asked to read. Even that 500 words, one page on computer type or a page and a half handwriting, that is long enough to try to practice to rebuild these pathways and this stamina that just very quick skim has eroded. The easiest thing to do here, and it doesn't matter what exam board the school study, they're all the same. We'll get to that at some point, I'm sure. They're all the same. They all ask for the same thing. They give out these sources of information. You could ask the head of English at the school, or if you were lucky enough to have one, a librarian at the school, gather up all of these 500 word resources, put them into a booklet, give them out. Maybe every time there's a 500 word article on BBC Sport or whatever the article of the day is on a certain website, get students to read that. That 500 words is exactly the same amount of information that they'll be dealing with in the exam, and it's long enough to classify as something that needs a significant focus over a 5-minute period of time. It doesn't have to mean hours, but even minutes now is the focus, because we're dealing in seconds when it comes to scrolling through social media.
Interesting.
So that would be my first. The second, a bit quicker, the power of modeling. Students have got to see great handwritten work if they're going to be expected to do it. So whether it's a live modeling from a teacher's point of view underneath a visualizer, or a photocopy of a great piece of work that's been handwritten by one student in the class, expecting students to produce great writing without seeing great writing is like a piano teacher sitting next to a pianist and saying, right, off you go.
Yeah.
That pianist is sitting there thinking, well, do you mind playing it first? And I'll watch your fingers and I'll listen to what you do and then I'll do it. If we're not modeling what we expect, then there will be a problem. So the power of the model is second. Third would be leaning into verbal, getting students to convey well-structured, well-considered, detailed verbal paragraphs. Because if they can do that verbally and you say exactly like that, write it down, then they're using speech to practice. Speech is very often underutilized in the classroom setting, specifically in a clear, detailed and considered response, where a student might give a statement, evidence, inference, that kind of things, almost exactly like an exam paragraph, but verbal. It's a great way of practicing, and for the student to get their confidence up to say, that's exactly what I need, write that down. To the power of verbal paragraphs rather than just closed answers, etc.
Yeah.
All staff driving whole school literacy. Yeah. Literacy being, the foundation for classroom engagement and examination outcome. being a whole school responsibility, especially in secondary. Within secondary, the school splits its English department into language and literature. But every language teacher is also teaching literacy. Every literature teacher is also teaching literacy. Every PE, history, music, geography, physics, everyone is their own subject and literacy, because the fundamental skills proficiency to read, write, speak, and listen underpins everything. So for all staff to drive whole school literacy. And the final thing for that tip is a linguistic consistency. It makes sense. Every teacher must refer to concepts in the same way. If we use the phrase extracting evidence from the text in history, we want extracting evidence from the text in English. We don't want find me a piece of quotation. We want a shared uniform language so that students are getting the same diet of aspiration regardless of the classroom or corridor.
Fascinating, Tom. Well said. Absolutely brilliant. Some huge, highly important hints, tips, recommendations, but again, experiences as to what you're seeing, hearing, involved with in many, many schools and multi-academy trusts. Tom, I would love to now ask you just to talk to us a little bit more about EdenFiftyOne. So the listeners today, I'm sure, are loving your content. I certainly am. But we'd love to learn about EdenFiftyOne. So all of this incredible experience and knowledge and expertise you have, you've channeled it into EdenFiftyOne. So tell us a little bit about your solution to help school and multi-academy trust leaders, if you would, Tom.
Of course. So I'd mentioned before about going into teaching as a dyslexic and wanting to promote clarity above everything else. So I wanted to lead a direct assault on grade culture, because the education conversation is obsessed with the summative finish line. But I think we've made a fundamental mistake in this, in that we've confused the value that's attributed to the finish line with the support needed to actually get there. What we try and do is to break English down into lots of little pieces, lots of universal, permanent little pieces, 51 of them, so 18 for writing, 18 for reading, and 15 for speaking and listening, so that students, parents, teachers, leaders, whether that's a head of department or a school or a mat leader, can see exactly what is needed for an individual to grab hold of and to understand and to own in order for them to move forward. Unfortunately, when you give a student the summative value of a grade, or a word for that matter, so a student might be told they're developing or they're told they're a grade 3, it doesn't mean anything. It only means something at the end of the journey when they're given that honour certificate to take to a sixth form or a college or an employer. But using a grade-themed currency for every day of the teaching and learning journey, to me, just didn't make any sense. So EdenFiftyOne is all of the skills taken out of any exam board. So it doesn't matter which exam board a school studies, those skills are taken out and each one is given a traffic light color. And it means that students can see not just that they need to work on their English or work on their writing or their reading. It means they can see a hyper-focused, hyper-granular segment that might be their area for improvement. So maybe paragraphing or punctuation, meaning that every student gets this hyper-personalized learning journey. It was also important when I created this that I was being expected to lead on grade-based improvement as a head of English, but simply knowing that a handful of your students are on grade 3s or 4s or 5s doesn't tell you how to teach them and how to intervene. This process, which I originally built in Microsoft Excel, enabled me and my colleagues to see exactly what the intervention on Wednesday afternoon should focus on. So it might be we'll do paragraphs this week with Macbeth, and we'll do extracting evidence next week with an inspector calls, and the week after we'll do punctuation with maybe some of the poetry skills. It meant that we could choose something so small that it was tangible to us as teachers and leaders, removing the kind of overwhelm of our jobs, just always trying to improve English, but also for learners who had previously thought, I don't get English, I can't do English. It's no wonder a lot of them feel like that when English is always discussed so summatively and represented with a summative grade. So at EdenFiftyOne, we break everything down into simple, clear, color-coded pieces to remove that overwhelm on both sides of the desk and to try and offer something much more clear and equitable for everybody.
Thank you very much, Tom. And listeners, I'm sure you're thinking, oh, I'd like to have a look at this. I'd like to, Tom's whet your appetite brilliantly as he has done mine throughout the podcast. And I would highly recommend you have a chat with Tom, get in touch, have a look at EdenFiftyOne, or if you want to pick Tom's brains, not about EdenFiftyOne, but pick Tom's brains. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? How do you deal with this in the classroom? Always great to build a new relationship, always great to exchange ideas, strategies, concepts, etc. So I know, Tom, you'd welcome anyone and everyone to get in touch, have a chat, whether it's on a personal basis, whether it's to explore EdenFiftyOne or anything in between. So yeah, I'd highly recommend everyone that you get in touch with Tom. On that note, Tom, please share your contact details. How can the listeners get in touch with you?
So 3 different ways. If they would like to head to EdenFiftyOne.com, you can learn more about the platform and you can contact us from there. If you'd like to get in touch with me directly, you can use tom@EdenFiftyOne.com, or if you would like to connect with me on LinkedIn. And if, as you've said, Matt, if there's just general questions on school improvement, student engagement, student outcomes, whatever it is, if it involves literacy, language or literature from Key Stage 3 to Key Stage 5, then more than happy to have a conversation.
Thanks very much, Tom. Listeners, thank you for dialing in, whether you're on Spotify or YouTube. Obviously, today's theme has been incredibly interesting, all about the literacy gap, and Tom's got some brilliant content that he's kindly shared with you. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Tom, thank you for being this week's special guest. We're incredibly grateful indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.